Hello and welcome. My name is Tirza and I'm the digital pastor here at IES, and I'm so glad that you're here with us today. We are conversing today with Pastor Mike Rody. Hi, Pastor Mike, welcome.
Hi there.
I'm excited because this is the first time I get to chat with you on Take a Beat.
Well, I'm glad to be here. It's exciting to be invited. Thank you.
Yeah, so, okay, tell us a little bit more about yourself, your family, where you're from. I don't know, interesting information.
Well, first thing I want to say is I'm just glad that this is not called Take a Beating.
No.
That would have been rough. But I'm Mike Rody. I grew up in the Seattle area in the US. Lived overseas as a kid for a while. Been in international church there. I've been in international church here. We came back to Jakarta in 2013 as a family with my wife and two boys. One of them has graduated, moved on to university. The other one is a senior here and will move on this next year. So my wife and I are looking at empty nest,
Ooh.
which is kind of exciting and kind of not exciting at the same time. So we'll see how that goes.
Actually, you brought it up in your sermon that when your parents dealt with like empty nest thing, what's the word for it? Empty nest. They had to like refocus, work on their relationship. Have you started planning what you want to do or how, like?
Well, you know, it's interesting because one of the curious things about my parents, my mom literally got pregnant 2 weeks after they got married. So my sister was there 9 months later, and they had very little time as a couple before they had kids. My wife and I were married for 5 years before we had kids, so we had a lot of time, and we still think about that. But we are in that process of trying to think, okay, how's it going to be? I think my wife and I probably have a lot more regular engagement with each other than maybe my parents did at the time. And a big part of that, as I mentioned in the thing, was my dad. I mean, he was just a non-interactive, non-people person for a lot of different reasons. And it wasn't an issue of him being the sinful, awful guy. It was just an issue of life had consumed him, and he had become what he had become, and it wasn't what God would have said was good. But I think really God kind of got him excited about the possibility for change. And though he was a godly man, he still had room to grow. And that was kind of the story that we were talking about there.
So actually, one of the things that stayed in my mind from your sermon was when you were talking about how it was in the garden with Adam and Eve, and then you talked about, well, when sin comes in, you talked about desire being unrestrained. Can we talk a little bit about that? What did you mean by that?
Yeah.
And because that, even just the way you were explaining that was so like poignant. I like that word, by the way.
Yeah.
And so that, can we talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So the picture in the when God says it's good, I mean, everything's just like smooth. And this is what really inspired me about this, was that just Adam and Eve, God, no conflict, no problem, everything was just smooth. And then the serpent projects this, hey, you know, you could be like God. In other words, it wasn't a, hey, you could have this quality and capacity. It was, you could have this position. You know, you could climb the ladder. And she looks at the fruit and she sees it. And of course, in this, that is like a reference. She's also seeing this future of being like God, you know. And so it becomes this thing where she does her own thing and it's sin. But in just a couple chapters, we see the sons of man noticing that women are beautiful and they marry any of them they feel like. Now, that sounds pretty euphemistic for some pretty violent behavior, in my opinion. And I think that's really the implication of Genesis, that people had gotten to a place where when they saw something and they wanted it, they just took it.
Yeah.
And that was the pattern. And of course, we see that later in Sodom and Gomorrah. We see that a number of times in the history of Israel. And all of those times, God really comes down on people and judges them. But what he also tries to do in those times is protect those who are set apart for his purpose and change the hearts of humanity back to him. So yeah, unrestrained. Visual becomes action.
Yeah, and I think when I was, while you were talking about that, I was just thinking, in Judges, the line that they keep on saying is, and people did what was right in their own eyes.
Yeah. And Judges is this amazing book that you should always read as one big piece, because you realize reading it in one big piece that the people who are unrighteous at the beginning are at about the same level as the people who are righteous at the end. Like there's just this cascading slide of the people of Israel into depravity and sin. I mean, it's the same thing. Doing what's right in their own eyes.
And what's interesting is the desires are, like, I feel like our desires are not bad. Like, we are given desires by God, but the let loose and the unrestrained bit is like a fire, and it, like, everything catches on fire and creates forest fires, right?
That's the line from James that you're referring to. And we see it like in the book of Isaiah. It's really interesting because Isaiah is this prophet and he seems to be part of the royal family somehow. But he's prophesying in a time in Israel when they're very affluent. But the affluent, in their pursuit of affluence, are taking advantage of other Israelites and oppressing them, taking advantage of widows and orphans. And so Isaiah is against this. So we see this throughout Scripture. People see something and they want it. And they don't, when they don't think, wait, what does God want for me?
Yeah.
Or they don't trust that God actually has something better for me. And that's really
Is that the root of it though? You think that men, and I'm not just talking like men, but people, humanity don't trust God to provide for them, to give them good gifts.
Yeah. We think we all struggle with it. I don't care how godly we are, there are times where we want more than what we have.
Oh yeah.
And sometimes we want things, and I'm sure you've had this experience where you want something so bad and later on you realize, oh, I'm so glad I didn't get it because that would have been a disaster. High school girlfriend would have been that for me. But anyway, I mean, she was, praise God, it didn't work out.
Yes.
Would have been so much trouble.
Yeah, well, me too. High school boyfriend, worst 3 months of my life. All of the teens knew him as worst 3 months of my life because he's great for sermon illustration, not great for life. Just saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that you're totally right. And I was just kind of thinking about my own life and how a lot of the times I decide, oh, I know better. And so, or I feel like somehow if I have control over stuff, that I would know better and I would do better. And yeah, I feel like that's part of our challenge as humans is to trust God.
And you know the complication in that, and this is where this is a topic for every believer. You know, even if we're at a place where we're grown in maturity, we're following God, there still comes a place where God might say, you know, you got other things to do, and we're like, wait a second, I have to go from this very stable situation to change. You know, when we were pastoring the States, I really felt around November that it was time to go, and I talked to my wife and we prayed about it, and we didn't talk to anyone else about it. And a few weeks later, Pastor Dave called and said, hey, you know, we've been thinking about this for 2 years, but would you be willing to come to Jakarta? And to be honest, it wasn't a obvious thing to follow God in that. And the safe thing, or the thing that would have been, there were some other opportunities along the way that, could have been cool too. And, but sometimes we're challenged to follow God in ways that aren't overtly sin, not sin, but trusting in Him to provide for us, to do what's good for us. Those are hard things, and I think we don't just experience that once in a life. I think if we're following God, we will often be challenged by those. I know for us in ministry, it's part of our life.
Yes. And it doesn't get any easier when you're in ministry, I don't think.
This is a funny thing. So when I was in Ferndale, there were these three other pastors, and we would get together. We called ourselves the young bishops of Whatcom County. It was kind of a joke. And we were all sitting talking to this older pastor who had retired, but he was in his 80s, really good guy. And one of the guys says, "Oh man, I look forward to being your age, because temptation won't be so great." And he just broke out laughing. He says, "Oh, it's just different temptation, It's just different struggle, but there's still those issues of, hey, I got to choose to follow God no matter what I'm doing." Yeah.
And one of the things that you mentioned in your sermon, I'm just kind of drawing us back to your
Sure.
sermon, was submitting everything, taking captive of everything, and putting it under God's rule. And so what does that look like in our relationships? Because we were talking about relationships and strong families and all kinds of relationships. We're not just talking about marriage, but like how would that look like in our daily lives?
All right, so let's say you have a conversation, say with your mother-in-law, who doesn't want to hear the truth, and you've got to figure out, how do I tell her the truth, but in a way that's going to be productive for her? Or let's say you have a child who is non-communicative and is just frustrating to no end. How do you deal with that in a way that's productive for them and not just you lashing out in anger?
Yeah.
Or, might happen with a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a spouse, where it's like, how can I be what I need to be? Because sometimes that's not what I want to be.
Yeah.
So when my wife and I were first married, we had a pretty rough first couple of years, and we had a lot of arguments because our communication style was really different. Our conflict resolution style was very different. One of us had a conflict resolution style, and one of us had a more conflict style. It was just like it was complicated. And, we had to learn how to do what was in each other's best interest, even when it wasn't what we had been programmed as children to do, or what we had grown up to think is the normal thing to do. And we've grown tremendously, both of us have. I've learned how to apologize much better, and she's learned how to not feel bad so easily. I mean, we've really grown a long ways in that. But that is that whole putting our relationships under the authority of God.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was me with my mom growing up. So we had very similar personalities, and so when we fight. and we just didn't see eye to eye. And so I think it was my junior year of high school where we actually ended up, and I have a feeling that my mom actually did this on purpose, but she would drive to school. She was a teacher at the school that I was going to, that's always interesting. But we would commute to school and then back from school together. And so we spent time together, and we, maybe less me, but she did. I think she worked on our relationship so that after that, I think I had such a great relationship with her, and she was like my number one support. So yeah, even that, like, I think you also shared in your sermon how your family members, your parents worked on relationships. And I think that's something that we don't think about. We feel like, oh, relationships need to come naturally or organically, and we don't have to work on it. We just if it's meant to be, it should just be smooth sailing.
I think one of the things that I've seen both as a pastor and as just a regular average person is that, when it comes to like parent-child relationships, some parents really come at it with a strategy of, hey, how can I help my child grow? And some parents come out of it as things come up, I will respond. And I watching what my dad did, I mean, we had a huge shift in our relationship, very positive. And I just saw that as, hey, I need to invest in my kids, and I need to go from the very beginning with what's going to be best for their growth, and not just what's going to make me feel good or make me look good or make me happy.
Yeah.
And that is not always easy. Sometimes you really want to let loose on your kids, and you really have to say, okay, that's not going to be healthy for them. And then there's been times with, I'm not exactly an angry guy, but there were times with my eldest where I would just raise my voice and scold him, even though I really just wanted to just talk to him like I'm talking to you. Yeah. But I knew he needed it. It was what was best for him. He needed to hear that intensity, or he wasn't gonna respond. And so I remember one time walking up the stairs thinking, okay, how am I gonna do this? And so I figured out kind of my strategy, and then I raised my voice, and anyway, it was a very productive voice raising, but not not uncontrolled in any way. But
I think that's the point, right? It's intentional. You thought about it. Yep. It's something that is it's strategized to fit your child.
Yeah.
It's not unrestrained emotions. It's not, oh, I am just going to rail on you and not care about what happens to you.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my mentors was my pastor growing up, Jack Roselle.
Oh, I know him.
And he has this, his definition of love is essentially that if you love someone, you're going to do what's in their best interest. That's my summary of his definition. And I remember so many nights in our early marriage, laying in bed with my wife, going at it in our arguments, and just reminding myself, I love her, and I'm gonna do what's in her best interest. And so no matter what my wife was saying, I was committed to doing that. And I think that was good. Did I lose a chance to be really mean sometimes? Yeah. Could I have said some really nasty things sometimes? I absolutely could have, but it wouldn't have been productive, and I'm really glad I didn't. I'm sure there's plenty of times where I said more than I should have too.
So, I think we're running out of time. I wish this is longer. But we talked about, you talked about, I was listening, restoring relationships, or restoration and relationship. And so we know this, we're all humans. There are sometimes relationships where, it's cracked or broken, or, we've hurt each other. How do you think we can start repairing some of these relationships?
One of the key things to understand is that a relationship is two people, and if one person wants it to be better and chooses to be different in their own response and reactions, it will improve the relationship. Yeah. And that goes for parents with their kids, that goes for a spouse with their spouse, that goes for you with your adult parents or siblings. If you make the choice to relate to people in a way that is godly, to relate to people with their best interests at heart, being willing to be vulnerable, and even being willing to endure their problem, but respond in a good way. It doesn't mean you just let people walk all over you. There are times to hold people accountable. Jesus did, you know. But if we do that, our other relationships do improve. There's a great book, I wish I could remember the title, by Dr. Ed Wheat. It's not the book about sex, it's the book about marriage, but basically his contention is if one spouse wants to improve their relationship, even if the other spouse isn't making an effort, it will improve. And I'm a firm believer of that. I think I've seen that in a number of people. And I think watching my dad do that was great.
Yeah. So rather than like us taking Ephesians 5 and saying, oh, you need to do that, but starting with ourselves and actually saying, I am going to submit to God and start submitting to each other. I think that's revolutionary. This whole God's household conversation that Paul had with the Ephesians. It's just, I think you said this in your sermon, it's just a new way of doing things. It's different.
Yeah, absolutely. It is the shakeup that happens in Christian faith. And can you imagine if Adam and Eve would have started out that way? Wow. You know, they could have submitted to God and not eaten the fruit, but even afterwards they could have submitted to God and said, oh, I'm sorry, I failed. And,
rather than hide.
Rather than hide, blame each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I think that's key, and I just want to drive that home for all of you who's listening, and for myself as well, to start from submitting to the Lord and saying, okay, your way, your will, not mine.
Yeah.
And so that desire is restrained. And, you know, going back to PD's first sermon in this series, it's in alignment to God.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for joining me and for chatting with me, Pastor Mike. And thank you for joining us. And if you missed out on Pastor Mike's sermon, it's online on our YouTube channel. And also, just comment and connect with us on Instagram and our online community. There's a lot of different ways to connect with us. We would love to hear from you, and tune in next week for Take a Beat.